The moment reality broke did not happen in a laboratory. It happened quietly, in a place designed to preserve time, not bend it. In the autumn of 1957, a night watchman at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. noticed something that made him stop walking mid-corridor. A man stood in front of a restricted display case, studying a document that had not yet been released to the public. That alone was unusual, but what froze the guard in place was the way the man reacted. He leaned closer, smiled faintly, and whispered a date that had not yet arrived. Then he turned around and asked a question that made no sense at all. "So this is what you decided to erase?" The guard demanded identification. The man reached into his coat and handed over a credential stamped with an agency that would not exist for another 7 years. When the guard looked back up, the man was gone. No alarms, no exits triggered, just an empty corridor and a question that would never be answered. How could someone know what history would hide before it happened? What textbooks never told you is that this was not the first time something like this occurred. It was not even rare. Across decades, scattered through archives, police reports, academic footnotes, and dismissed testimony, there exists a pattern of encounters that share one disturbing detail. The people involved were not confused. They were specific. They referenced events that had not yet happened, technologies not yet invented, and historical outcomes that had not yet been decided. And when these encounters were documented, the records were quietly reclassified, mislabeled, or explained away as clerical errors. It does not like witnesses who arrive early. In AE, newspapers across the American Midwest reported a strange phenomenon that historians later labeled a mass hallucination. Dozens of towns described a large, silent, cigar-shaped craft floating overhead at night. Witnesses reported a single occupant who spoke fluent English, asked detailed questions about local infrastructure, and carried tools no one could identify. At the time, powered flight did not exist. The Wright brothers were still bicycle mechanics. Yet this figure described future aviation routes, predicted the rise of radio communication, and warned several towns of fires and floods that would occur years later. When some of those predictions came true, the article stopped. The event was reframed as folklore, but folklore does not leave engineering sketches behind. This one did. Real evidence that should not exist tends to hide in plain sight. In 1943, during the height of World War II, a man was detained near a restricted rail junction in Italy. He carried no weapon, no papers, and no clear reason for being there. What he did carry was a notebook filled with diagrams of magnetic field manipulation, time dilation calculations, and references to atomic decay processes that would not be formally understood until decades later. Military intelligence assumed espionage. Scientists who later reviewed fragments of the notebook disagreed. The math was not wrong, it was premature. And in the margins, written repeatedly in the same careful hand, was a phrase that no one at the time understood: temporal displacement error. Across continents, similar anomalies appear. In 1921, excavations beneath Rome uncovered stone structures far older than the surrounding ruins. The cuts were too precise, the angles too consistent. Embedded into one wall was a geometric spiral carved with mathematical regularity, identical to symbols found in Neolithic Ireland and pre-dynastic Egypt. There was no known cultural link, no trade route, no migration path, yet the design was exact. More unsettling was a thin layer of vitrification on the stone surface, as if it had been briefly exposed to extreme heat and then cooled rapidly. This effect is known today. It appears at nuclear test sites. It should not appear under Rome. Connections across time do not announce themselves loudly. They repeat quietly. A man detained in Japan in 1954 carried a passport from a country that did not exist. The document was authentic by every metric available at the time. Correct stamps, correct paper, correct aging. The man insisted his country had existed for over 1,000 years and pointed to a location between France and Spain. Authorities assumed confusion, but his passport referenced treaties that would not be signed until decades later. When pressed, he became agitated, not confused. "It changed," he said. "It wasn't supposed to change." He was held overnight. In the morning, he was gone. So was the passport. Introduce a forbidden explanation, and the discomfort begins. What if these were not isolated incidents, or hoaxes, or errors? What if they were artifacts of a process that occasionally leaks? Modern physics already accepts that time is not a constant. Under extreme conditions, it bends. It slows. It behaves differently depending on speed, gravity, and energy. What physics avoids discussing is direction. Time may not flow as cleanly forward as human perception insists. Theoretical models allow for closed time-like curves. Solutions to Einstein's equations permit paths that loop through time. The math does not forbid it. It simply warns that consequences would be unpredictable. Now consider a different possibility. Not accidental time travel, not uncontrolled displacement, but deliberate navigation. A system refined enough to target specific moments, observe outcomes, and make corrections. This would not look like dramatic arrivals. It would look like quiet interventions. Missing documents, altered discoveries, people appearing briefly, then vanishing. Not to change everything. The pattern behind the pattern becomes visible when you stop asking whether time travel is possible and start asking why it would be used. Technologies appear mature. Knowledge seems inherited. The Industrial Revolution did not begin with crude steam engines. It began with systems already optimized. Mathematics advanced in leaps, not steps. Certain discoveries emerge almost simultaneously in different parts of the world, as if released on schedule. And when events threaten large-scale instability, they often resolve through improbable coincidences. A delayed decision, a missed signal, a sudden failure that prevents something worse. History feels less like chaos and more like something being nudged. Then comes the twist, the unsettling realization that time travelers, if they exist, may not be explorers or tourists or rebels. They may be archivists, custodians. Their goal would not be to change the past, but to preserve a viable future. And that would require interference that leaves no trace. Erasing discoveries that arrive too early. Suppressing technologies that destabilize societies not ready to handle them. Allowing certain catastrophes to occur because preventing them would lead to something worse. In this framework, the man in the archive was not trespassing. He was checking work already done. And here is where the story turns inward, because the warning is not about time travel. It is about fragility. If civilization once learned how to navigate time, it likely did so after nearly destroying itself. The ability to correct history would only become necessary after history failed. That implies a future where humanity survives, but only barely. A future that looks back at us not with admiration, but concern. Our experiments with artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, climate manipulation, and biological engineering resemble the early stages of something that cannot be easily undone. The warnings embedded in history are subtle. Knowledge appears. Knowledge disappears. Certain paths close without explanation, which leads to the big question that refuses to stay quiet. If time travelers are already here, if they are already intervening, then what does that say about the future they are protecting? And more importantly, what event are they trying to stop right now? But this is not where the story ends, because there is another possibility, one that offers a different kind of ending, a hopeful one. What if the goal is not to prevent disaster, but to guide humanity toward a point where time travel is no longer needed? A future where civilizations no longer collapse, where knowledge is preserved, where progress does not require correction. In that scenario, time travelers would not be guardians forever. They would be teachers preparing their past to stand on its own. And if that is true, then the final intervention may not be a disappearance. It may be a reveal, a moment when humanity realizes that time was never a prison, but a responsibility, and that the future has been watching, not to control us, but to see whether we are finally ready to join it. What finally breaks the silence is not a machine, a message, or a dramatic arrival. It is a pattern that becomes too consistent to ignore. When historians map moments where progress abruptly slows, reverses, or disappears, the same signature appears again and again. Not chaos, not randomness, intervention. Technologies that could have accelerated civilization vanish just before destabilizing consequences. Discoveries that threaten to reshape power structures arrive decades early, then stall until the world catches up socially. Entire lines of research go cold without explanation, only to reemerge generations later as if released from quarantine. In the late 1960s, a physicist working on gravitational wave detection published a paper proposing a method to locally distort space-time using oscillating mass-energy fields. The math was sound, too sound. The implications were immediate. Controlled time, dilation, potential causality loops. Within months, funding was cut. The paper stopped being cited. The physicist abandoned academia and spent the rest of his life teaching high school physics, insisting to students that the universe was far stranger than they were being told. Years later, fragments of his original work resurfaced inside a classified defense research program under a different name, authored by no one. This is where the system becomes visible. Time travel does not operate like science fiction. There are no grand paradoxes, no dramatic confrontations with ancestors. It operates like version control, a continuous audit of reality where deviations are flagged, evaluated, and either permitted or rolled back. The goal is not perfection, it is survivability, a future that exists at all. Anthropologists once puzzled over the sudden disappearance of advanced tool-making techniques at the end of the Upper Paleolithic. Bone needles capable of precision tailoring vanish. Composite weapons disappear. Cultural complexity contracts. The explanation offered was climate stress. But climate stress does not selectively erase specific technologies while leaving others intact. It does not target knowledge. Something chose what was allowed to persist. The same pattern appears in ancient metallurgy. Evidence exists of steel-like alloys appearing centuries before their accepted invention, only to vanish without a trace. Roman concrete that heals itself is forgotten. Antikythera-level mechanisms never become widespread. These are not failures of imagination. They are failures of continuity. Knowledge reaches a threshold, then retreats. If time travelers exist, they would have learned a brutal lesson early. It requires letting empires fall before they globalize destruction. It requires letting technologies remain unrealized until societies mature enough to absorb them without tearing themselves apart. The twist deepens when modern data analysis is applied to historical randomness. Events that should have escalated catastrophically often fail in strangely precise ways. Mechanical failures that defy probability. Decisions made at the last moment that avert irreversible outcomes. Corrections. During the Cold War, there were at least 6 documented incidents where nuclear launch protocols came within minutes of activation due to false data. In every case, a single individual chose to hesitate. A radar officer dismissed a signal. A commander delayed a response. Analysts later noted that statistical likelihood favored at least one full exchange, yet it never happened. Civilization survived by margins too thin to credit chance alone. What if those margins were engineered? This reframes the role of time travelers completely. They are not heroes altering timelines for personal gain. They are risk managers operating across centuries. Their presence would be subtle because it has to be. Obvious interference creates instability. Awareness creates unpredictability. The fewer people who know, the safer the correction. Which brings us to the most disturbing realization. If time travelers are real, they cannot come from a future that is stable. They must come from one that nearly failed. A future scarred by collapse, where entire histories were lost, where knowledge was fragmented, where survival demanded radical solutions. Time travel would not be a triumph. It would be an emergency measure. That future would look back at us, not as ancestors to be admired, but as a critical fault line, the moment where everything almost went wrong. And then something changes. In the early 21st century, an anomaly appears in global research patterns. Suppression gives way to release. Artificial intelligence advances rapidly. Space observation accelerates. Genetic medicine breaks ethical deadlocks almost overnight. Climate modeling improves with uncanny precision. Knowledge that had once stalled now floods forward in coordinated waves. Not randomly, sequentially, as if unlocked. This suggests a shift in policy. The interventions are no longer purely preventative. They are preparatory, because something is approaching that cannot be stopped by small corrections. Astrophysical data reveals increased solar instability over long-term models. Climate systems show nonlinear thresholds far closer than expected. Technological acceleration introduces risks that compound faster than regulation can adapt. The future, whatever it is, appears to have determined that humanity must now advance, not slow down. That survival requires capability, not restraint. This is the reversal that changes everything. Time travelers are no longer trying to keep us ignorant. They are trying to get us ready. The missing technologies begin to reappear. Quantum theories, once dismissed, gain experimental backing. Exotic propulsion concepts quietly receive funding. Research into space-time manipulation returns under new frameworks. The very ideas that once vanished now surface as open questions rather than forbidden paths, which leads to the warning. Time travel does not save civilizations. It only buys them time. The future cannot keep intervening forever without erasing itself. Each correction introduces instability. Each change creates branches that must be monitored. Eventually, the system collapses under its own complexity. There is a limit to how many times history can be rewritten before it fractures. That limit may be approaching. This implies that humanity is nearing a moment where it must choose its own path without correction, a point where external intervention ceases, either because it is no longer necessary or no longer possible, a future where time travelers stop arriving because they no longer exist to send them. Which leaves us with the final question, not whether time travel is real, not whether it has already happened, but whether we are the last corrected version of humanity, or the first that must stand alone. And here is the hopeful ending, subtle but real. If time travelers exist, if they have been guiding us, if they are now stepping back, then it means something extraordinary. It means that in at least one future, humanity survives long enough to look backward with intention. It means we do not destroy ourselves immediately. It means we learn, we adapt, we endure. The quiet corrections in history suggest not a doomed species, but a resilient one. A civilization that fell before, learned from collapse, and reached far enough into time to give itself another chance. The future did not erase us. It invested in us. Time travel, then, is not a story about escaping the past. It is a story about responsibility across generations, about decisions made today, echoing backward and forward simultaneously, about understanding that the present is not a fixed point, but a hinge on which entire futures turn. The haunting question from the archive returns, reframed by everything we now understand. So this is what you decided to erase. Perhaps the better question is what we choose to preserve. Because if the future is watching, not to control us, but to see whether we are ready, then every discovery, every restraint, every ethical decision matters more than we realize, not just for what comes next, but for what has already happened. And maybe, just maybe, the final correction has already been made, not by someone arriving from the future, but by us, deciding to become one worth arriving from. Some questions don't come with clear answers. Some stories don't end, they linger. What matters is not what we think we know, but what we're willing to question. If this story made you pause, reflect, or look at the world a little differently, then it's done its job. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy thoughtful stories grounded in reality, curiosity, and careful analysis, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.